The booking was a gift from my sister. She'd put money toward it for almost 2 years before handing me the printed itinerary across her kitchen table the previous Christmas, watching my face the way people watch a slow-loading screen. 8 nights out of Fort Lauderdale, down through the Western Caribbean, ending back where it started. She told me I'd been working through weekends since the divorce, and that if I didn't take the trip, she would cancel it on principle. I argued for the form of it and packed the bag the next morning. I'm telling this from a notebook I started keeping on the second day, when the first official announcement came through the corridor speakers. The notebook is the only reason I trust the order of things. Memory shifts after something like that. The notebook doesn't. Before the story continues, I want to know something. Where are you right now while listening to this? Are you alone, or just passing time? And if you have a story idea, or want to see yourself inside one of these survival stories, leave a comment with your name. I might pick it for the next one. All right, let's begin the story. The ship was called the Meridian Estrella, registered out of Nassau, 11 decks above the waterline and 3 below, somewhere around 2,400 passengers and a crew of about 900. I checked those numbers against the laminated safety card in my cabin during the first muster drill, which they ran out of habit and Bahamian regulation about 2 hours after we boarded. I remember standing at my muster station on deck 4, with my orange life vest hooked under my arms, while a young officer named Petar walked us through the brace position. He had a thick accent and a tired smile. He told us where the assembly stations were if anything went wrong. He was very specific that we should never run on the stairs. I didn't speak to Lana Deli until the 3rd evening. Before that, I'd seen her twice. Once at the buffet on the morning of the 2nd day, where she'd been arguing quietly with a server about whether the pineapple was fresh. And once that same afternoon at the rear pool, where she sat reading a paperback with a pencil in her hand, marking lines. She was maybe my age, mid-30s, dark hair tied back, a permanent half-frown that made her look like she was working through a math problem. She wore long sleeves at the pool, which I noticed because everyone else was burning. I thought she was traveling with someone, and then realized she wasn't. The 3rd evening I sat down 2 stools over from her, at the small bar near the aft observation lounge. There was a piano player working through something I couldn't name. I ordered a club soda because I'd already had 2 beers at dinner and wanted to sleep. She glanced at the glass and said, without looking at me, "Smart." "Pacing," I said. "That's the trick." She set her pencil between the pages of her book and closed it. The cover said something about urban planning. "You here alone?" "My sister bought it. She thought I needed a vacation." "And did you?" "I'm not sure yet." She told me her name was Lana, that she lived outside Pittsburgh, that she did contract work for a regional transit authority and was on the boat because her mother had died in March and her father had insisted she get off the continent for a week. She said all of this without performance, the way you'd describe a route you took to work. I told her my name and that I worked in commercial insurance, which is true, and was, even then, the least interesting thing about me. We talked for maybe 40 minutes. When she stood up, she said she was an early riser, and that if I happened to be on the promenade deck before sunrise, she'd buy the coffee. She didn't make it a flirtation. It came out the way she might have given directions. I went. I bring this up because if I hadn't gone the next morning, I'd have been on deck 9 when the first reports came in, instead of on deck 7, and I'd have been swept into the corridor crush with everyone else. Small things compound. The first reports were not panicked. The corridor speakers chimed, and a woman's voice, unhurried, asked all passengers to return to their cabins for a brief health screening. She used the phrase, "an isolated medical incident," twice. Lana and I were on the open promenade with our coffees, looking at a thin gray line of land off the port side that was probably Cuba. She heard the announcement, set her cup down on the rail, and said, "That's not a routine phrase." "How would you know?" "My aunt was a hospital administrator. They train you to use words that don't trigger calls." I thought she was reading too much into it. I was wrong, but not in the way I expected. We finished our coffees and walked back through the interior because the wind had come up. On the way through the atrium on deck 5, we passed two stewards moving fast, one of them carrying a folded blue tarp, which I thought was strange and didn't ask about. A small group had gathered near the elevators. Someone was crying, more from confusion than grief. A woman was saying that her husband had collapsed during breakfast, and the medical team had taken him on a stretcher, and she didn't know which deck the infirmary was on. I would later learn that the infirmary was on deck 2, accessible by a service elevator and a marked staff stairwell, and that by the time the woman was crying in the atrium, the infirmary already had 11 patients with similar symptoms: high fever, disorientation, a violent gastrointestinal episode, followed by what one of the nurses described in the reports she taped to the back of her cabin door as agitated unresponsiveness. That phrase got out into the corridors faster than the ship's official messaging. I heard it from a busboy named Felix on deck 6, about an hour after the first announcement. He was sitting on a service crate, eating an apple, and he told me, in the same flat tone I'd used to tell Lana what I did for a living, that something was wrong with the people downstairs. By midday, the ship had altered course. You could feel it in the slap of the water against the hull. We'd been steaming southwest, and now we were turning, slowly, in a wide arc. Lana noticed before I did. She'd been watching the wake from the railing on deck 11. She came down to the cafe where I was waiting out the strangeness of the morning and told me we were heading back toward Florida. "They're going home," she said, "or to the nearest port with a hospital. Either way, they've made a call." The captain's voice came through the speakers an hour later. He had a Croatian accent and a slow, deliberate way of speaking that I appreciated then and still appreciate now. He said the ship was returning to Fort Lauderdale at the request of the medical team. He said no one was in danger. He said the buffets and bars would remain open and that the evening's scheduled entertainment would continue. He said the word precaution 4 times in a 6-minute speech. Lana counted. The first death I knew about happened around 3 that afternoon. A man on deck 8 went into cardiac arrest in his cabin while waiting for a screening. The medical team got there fast, but he didn't survive the resuscitation attempt. I heard about it from his neighbor, an older woman named Beatrice, who'd been at the same dinner table as me on the first night. She found me in the library on deck 6 and sat down across from me and told me what she'd seen with her hands flat on the table. She was steady about it. She said the man had been bitten by his wife. I asked her to repeat that. She did, with the same flatness. His wife had collapsed at breakfast. That much had been obvious. She'd been taken to the infirmary. She'd come back 2 hours later, escorted by a steward, and put back into the cabin with an instruction that her husband watch over her and call if anything changed. Beatrice had heard the screaming through the wall around 2:30. She'd opened her cabin door because that's what you do, and she'd seen the steward running in the opposite direction with blood on his uniform. She closed her door. She sat on her bed for 10 minutes. Then she went out and found me because, she said, "You don't look like a man who panics." I didn't know what to do with that. I told her to go to her cabin and lock the deadbolt and the privacy latch and not open it for anyone she didn't know by voice. She thanked me and left. I sat in the library for another 20 minutes, trying to decide whether what she'd told me was true or grief-shaped. and then I went and found Lana. She was in her own cabin, on deck 7, 3 doors down from mine by coincidence and not design. She let me in and listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the carpet. When I finished, she said, "We need to think about water." That was the first survival decision either of us made, and it came out of her, not me. I'd been thinking about whether to believe Beatrice. Lana had skipped that question and gone to the next one. If something was spreading on the ship, the buffets would close. If the buffets closed, the bottled water would go fast. If the bottled water went fast, the tap water would still run for a while, because the ship made its own from seawater, but only as long as the desalination plant had power and crew to monitor it. She said all this in the same tone she'd used to tell me about her mother. We went up to deck 9 together and bought 12 bottles of water from the gift shop, paid with my room card without comment from the clerk, and brought them down to her cabin because she had more floor space. We bought a bag of granola bars and a tin of crackers from the same shop. The clerk, a young man named Davide, asked if we were stocking up for an excursion. We said yes. He smiled and wished us a good afternoon. I think about Davide sometimes. He was very polite. By dinner, the ship felt different. I can't put it more precisely than that. The corridors weren't empty, but people moved through them with their heads down. The buffet on deck 10 was open, but understaffed. There was no music. The captain came on the speakers again at 6 and said that out of an abundance of caution, all guests were being asked to dine in their cabins for the evening, and that room service would be provided complimentary. He said the medical situation was being managed. He used the word managed 3 times. Lana counted that one too. We ate together in her cabin off the room service trays. Pasta and bread, and a small salad that neither of us touched. She told me her father had been a transit engineer for 40 years and had taught her to read the body language of systems. She said the ship had stopped moving like a vacation and had started moving like an evacuation. The two looked similar from the outside, but felt different from inside. I asked her what she thought we should do. Stay quiet. Stay together. Pick a route. A route to where? To the lifeboats, eventually. Not yet. They'll be the last thing we touch. She showed me the safety card from her cabin door. The lifeboats were on deck 4, port and starboard, accessed through marked muster stations. Each lifeboat held 150 people. There were 20 boats and 8 inflatable rafts. The math worked if the boats launched in order and the crew was alive to launch them. If either of those conditions failed, the math became different math. We didn't sleep much that night. I went back to my cabin around 11 because Lana said she preferred to be alone when she tried to rest. I left my door propped open with the security latch in the half position so I could hear the corridor. I lay on the bed in my clothes with my shoes by the side. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a man crying somewhere down the hall, and around 3, I heard running footsteps that didn't sound like a steward's. At 4, I heard a single, contained scream that ended faster than it should have. I got up. I knocked on Lana's door. She was already dressed. We went to the stairwell at the aft end of deck 7 and stood on the landing listening. The stairwell was concrete and metal, painted institutional white, lit by emergency lamps that had switched on at some point during the night. From below came a sound I didn't recognize at first. It was rhythmic and wet and not quite human. It echoed up the stairwell from somewhere around deck 3 or 4. Lana put her hand on my arm, and we backed out of the stairwell and went down the corridor to the forward stairwell, which was quieter. And we climbed up to deck 9 because she wanted height and visibility before dawn. Deck 9 had an outdoor jogging track and a small cafe that was closed. We sat on a deck chair and watched the eastern horizon turn gray. The ship was still moving, but slower than the day before. Lana said the engine sounded different. I couldn't tell. The first infected person I saw with my own eyes came up the aft outdoor stairwell about 20 minutes after sunrise. It was a man in a bathrobe, barefoot, his face wrong in a way I struggled to describe even in my notebook. His mouth was open. His eyes weren't tracking. He moved with a kind of forward lurch, not fast, not slow, but committed, like a thing falling more than a thing walking. Lana saw him before I did. She put her hand over my mouth, which I think was instinct, and we both stayed very still on the deck chair, while he passed within 10 feet of us and continued forward toward the bow. He didn't see us. I don't know if he could. After he was gone, I asked Lana, very quietly, if she'd ever seen anything like that. She shook her head. She said her father had described once watching a transit worker have a stroke on a platform, and that the body had moved in ways the mind clearly couldn't explain. She said this wasn't that. This was something else. She said we needed to stop standing in the open. We went to the cabin I'd been using and packed what we could into a single duffel bag. Water, granola bars, a flashlight from the bedside drawer, a pocket knife I'd brought because I always brought one, her notebook, my notebook, her medication, which I learned about then for the first time. She had a thyroid condition and took a small white pill every morning. She had 3 weeks' worth in her toiletry kit. I asked if she was okay. She said she was, as long as the pills lasted. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. We moved her things into my cabin because mine was further from the aft stairwell, which we'd identified as the louder one. We taped a square of paper over the peephole because she said anything that could see in could be seen from. We pushed the desk in front of the door, which left only a narrow path, and we sat on the bed with the lights off and listened. The captain came on the speakers at 9 in the morning. His voice was different, slower, with longer pauses. He said the ship had declared a medical emergency to the United States Coast Guard. He said they were 80 nautical miles from Fort Lauderdale and were proceeding at reduced speed because of an issue in the engine room he did not specify. He said all passengers were to remain in their cabins. He said crew members were not to attempt to enter cabins without authorization from the bridge. That was the sentence that made Lana sit up. "They've lost crew," she said. "How can you tell? He wouldn't say that otherwise. He's telling them not to try anything." The speakers went silent. We sat for another hour. Lana wrote in her notebook. I wrote in mine. At some point, I realized I was hungry and didn't want to be, because eating meant opening the granola bars and using them up. We split one. The wrapper was very loud in the quiet room. Around 11, someone knocked on my door. I froze. Lana put her hand on my wrist, which I think she meant as a steadying gesture and which I felt as a warning. The knock came again. Then a voice. "It's Beatrice, from last night. Please. Anyone." Lana looked at me. I looked at her. We had a conversation with our faces that took about 3 seconds and that I still think about. She nodded. I got up and moved the desk. I opened the door on the chain. Beatrice was alone. Her hair was undone, and she had a small cut on her forearm that she'd wrapped in a hand towel. She wasn't crying. She told me, in the same flat voice as the day before, that her cabin neighbor on the other side had come into the corridor and that she'd run, and that she didn't know where else to go because she'd seen me take a key card out of this door yesterday and remembered the number. I asked her about the cut. She said she'd caught it on the corner of a service cart while running. She let me look at it. It was a clean scratch, no teeth. Lana came up behind me and looked too. We let her in. We moved the desk back. We gave her water. Beatrice was the first person we let in, and the last for a long time. And I have thought about the decision to open the door for her many times since. I think we did it because she was old and we knew her name. I don't know what we'd have done if it had been a stranger. I'm not sure we'd have done the same thing. That's an answer I owe. By the afternoon, there were 3 of us in a cabin built for 2. Beatrice slept on the bed because she was 81. Lana and I took shifts on the floor. We rotated who watched the door and who watched the porthole. The porthole faced port and showed nothing but ocean. The corridor outside the door produced sounds at irregular intervals. Footsteps, voices, once a long dragging sound that I do not want to describe. The captain came on at 3. His voice was steadier than at 9, which I read as either better news or better acting. He said the Coast Guard was sending vessels to escort us. He said the engine issue had been resolved and we were proceeding at a slightly increased speed. He said anyone in a cabin with a working telephone could dial extension 4 to reach the bridge directly. He said this with what sounded like pride, and I realized later he was telling us the bridge was still staffed and defended, and that the internal phone system was still working, which were both pieces of information he couldn't say plainly without admitting how much else had failed. Lana picked up our cabin phone and dialed 4. It rang for a long time. A woman answered. Lana asked, very politely, if there was an estimated arrival time. The woman said they were doing everything they could. Lana asked if there was a designated safe deck for passengers who had not been exposed. The woman paused. Then she said, Deck 4, forward starboard, the conference center, was being held by ship security, and screened arrivals were being admitted there. She gave Lana a code phrase to use at the door. She said the phrase was changed every 6 hours. She said the current phrase was harbor wind, and would change at 6 in the evening to something else, which she would not tell Lana now. Lana thanked her and hung up. We had a decision to make. The conference center was 4 decks below us and toward the bow. Between us and it were unknown numbers of corridors, 2 stairwells, an atrium, and at least 1 elevator bank. The elevators were almost certainly off. The stairwells had sounds in them. We had Beatrice, who could walk but not run. We had 3 bottles of water left from the 12 and most of the granola bars. We had no weapons except my pocket knife and a heavy flashlight that I'd taken from a maintenance closet on the way back the night before. Lana laid all this out the way she might have laid out a transit study. She didn't tell me what she thought we should do. She told me what we knew. Then she asked Beatrice, who was awake by then and listening, what she thought. Beatrice said, I don't want to die in a hallway. She said it like a preference, not a decision. We agreed to go at 4:30 in the afternoon, when the corridors would be in afternoon quiet, but before the light changed. We drank water. We ate 1 granola bar each. Lana taped the cabin key card to the inside of her sleeve in case we needed to get back. We propped open the desk again, and Lana stood by the door, listening for 10 full minutes before she nodded. The corridor on deck 7 was empty. The carpet had stains on it that I tried not to look at directly. We moved single file, Lana in front because she was the fastest, me at the back because I had the knife, Beatrice between us with her hand on my forearm. We made it to the forward stairwell without incident. The stairwell was quiet. We started down. Between deck 6 and deck 5, we heard something below us. Lana stopped on the landing. We listened. It was a single set of footsteps. Not the rhythmic, wet sound from the night before, just regular footsteps coming up. Lana motioned us back against the wall. The footsteps reached the deck 5 landing, paused, and then continued up. A man came around the turn. He was wearing a steward's uniform. He had a fire axe in his right hand and a radio clipped to his belt that wasn't on. He saw us and stopped. "Passengers," he said. It wasn't a question. "Going to deck 4, I said. "The conference center." He looked at the three of us. He looked at the axe. He said, "I'll walk you down. I'm going past it." We went together. His name was Aldo. He was Filipino, mid-20s, and he'd been a steward on Deck 9 until that morning. He said the medical team had been overrun around dawn. He said the bridge had ordered all uninfected crew to consolidate on Deck 4, and that he was on his way to drop off 2 passengers he'd found on Deck 6. Except the passengers had refused to come and barricaded themselves in their cabin and told him to go away. He said he understood. He said he was going to Deck 4 anyway, because at this point, staying mobile was worse than getting behind a locked door. He walked us down to the Deck 4 landing. The landing door was closed. He knocked in a pattern. 3 slow, 2 fast, 1 slow. A panel slid open at eye height. A man's face looked through it. Aldo said the phrase. The face nodded. The door opened. The conference center was a long, low-ceilinged space that had been designed for corporate retreats and now held maybe 40 people. There were chairs arranged in clusters. There were 2 security officers in white uniforms with radios and one with a sidearm. There was a folding table with bottled water and a clipboard. A woman in a blue blazer took our names and our cabin numbers and Beatrice's age and the medications Lana was taking. She did this efficiently and without warmth, which I appreciated. She told us where the bathrooms were. She told us the rules. No one entered or left without authorization. No one used the phones except crew. No one approached the door. If any of us developed symptoms, fever, confusion, agitation, we were to inform a security officer immediately and we would be moved to a separate room. She did not say what would happen in the separate room. Lana asked her how long the ship would take to reach Fort Lauderdale. The woman said the ship was no longer heading to Fort Lauderdale. She said it was heading to a Coast Guard rendezvous about 40 nautical miles off Key Largo, where passengers would be transferred to other vessels. She said this was a developing situation. She said she didn't have an arrival time. We sat down in a cluster of chairs near the back of the room. Beatrice fell asleep within 10 minutes. Lana and I stayed up. The conference center was not a bad place to be comparatively. It had 2 exits, both controlled. It had its own bathrooms. It had a small adjoining kitchen where bottled water and cereal bars and apples had been stockpiled by someone who had thought ahead. It had walls without windows, which Lana said was both a feature and a problem. Nothing could see us, but we couldn't see anything either. A radio behind the security desk produced occasional updates from the bridge. Aldo had gone forward to a separate crew muster point, and we did not see him again. The first night in the conference center was the longest of my life, which I say knowing that the second night would be worse. People slept in shifts. The lights stayed on. The security officers rotated every 2 hours. Around midnight, a woman in our cluster started crying quietly because her teenage son had stayed in their cabin on Deck 8 and refused to come down with her. She'd left him there with the deadbolt thrown. She kept asking the security officer if anyone was going up to retrieve people. The officer kept saying no. Around 2 in the morning, she got up and walked toward the door, and the security officer with the sidearm intercepted her and spoke to her, very gently, and walked her back to her chair. Lana watched all of this with her notebook open in her lap, not writing. In the morning, the captain came on the speakers and told us we were 30 nautical miles from the rendezvous point. He said the engine had developed a new issue, and we were now proceeding at 6 knots, which Lana told me was a fast walk. He said the Coast Guard had been informed. He said they were sending fast vessels to meet us. He sounded tired. Around 10 that morning, a second crew member arrived at the door with 3 more passengers. The procedure was the same: knock, phrase, panel, entry. The phrase had changed twice since we arrived. The new arrivals were a young couple and a man in his 50s who looked like he was in shock. The woman in the blazer took their information. The man in shock turned out to have a bite wound on his shoulder that he had concealed under his shirt. He admitted to it after 15 minutes when she asked him to remove the shirt for a temperature check. The 2 security officers escorted him out a different door than the one he'd come in through. The young couple sat near us without speaking. The blazer woman came over to our cluster about an hour after that. Her name was Officer Reyes. She knelt beside Lana's chair and asked, in a low voice, if either of us had professional skills that might be useful. I said insurance and felt foolish. Lana said transit planning and emergency egress. Reyes nodded and asked Lana to come with her. They went into a small office at the side of the room and stayed there for 40 minutes. When Lana came back, she sat down next to me and said, very quietly, "They don't have a plan for the rendezvous." "What do you mean?" "They have a destination. They don't have a procedure for what happens when we get there. They've been trying to get one from the Coast Guard for 18 hours, and the Coast Guard keeps saying it's being developed." "What did you tell them?" "I told them how to stage 200 people through one doorway in an order that doesn't kill anyone." They wrote it down. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at me directly and said, "If the rendezvous goes wrong, we don't stay with the group. We go to a lifeboat." Reyes wouldn't let us. "Reyes won't be in a position to stop anyone. She knows it." She didn't say so, but I watched her face when I said the phrase, "controlled disembarkation." She hasn't slept. They're going to lose order at the railing. I looked at her. I had known her for 4 days at that point. I had spent maybe 20 waking hours in her direct presence. I trusted her judgment more than I trusted anyone I had worked with for years. I don't know what to do with that fact even now. I think it's the cleanest thing the trip gave me. I told her okay. I told her I'd follow her lead. She told me to memorize the location of the nearest lifeboat. It was on deck 4, port side, 80 feet aft of the conference center, behind a marked muster door. She'd checked on the way in. She told me the door was unlocked from the inside in an emergency, and that the lifeboats had a hand-cranked davit system if the powered launch failed. She told me the boats had emergency rations and water for 72 hours and a hand-crank radio. She told me she'd read the safety card 3 times. She told me Beatrice would not survive a lifeboat launch. I had been waiting for her to say it, and I had been hoping she wouldn't. Beatrice was 81 and frail, and had a heart condition she'd mentioned once over dinner on the first night. The lifeboats launched by free-falling about 20 feet from their davits and hitting the water with significant force. The straps and braces were designed for healthy adults. Lana had seen the safety video. I asked her what she thought we should do. She said, "We don't decide that yet. We decide when we have to." That afternoon, the ship lost engine power for the second time. We felt it before we heard the announcement. The hum that had been the floor of the conference center for 2 days went out. The lights flickered and then steadied on emergency power. The captain came on 20 minutes later and said they had lost main propulsion and were running on auxiliary thrusters. He said the Coast Guard had been notified. He said his last position fix put them 11 nautical miles from the rendezvous. He said they would drift for now and use the thrusters to maintain heading. He sounded calm. I wrote in my notebook that he was a man worth following. I still think that. The ship settled into a different motion. Slower, looser, the sea acting on it more directly. Beatrice woke up and asked what was happening, and Lana told her in the same voice as everything else. Beatrice said, "I'm not going to make a lifeboat." She said it without self-pity. Lana said, "We're not at that decision yet." Beatrice said, "I'm telling you so you don't have to be." She closed her eyes again. Around 4 in the afternoon, the noise outside the conference center changed. It started as a single set of voices in the corridor, then more. Then the unmistakable sound of bodies hitting the door from the outside. The security officer at the door looked through the panel and stepped back fast. He spoke into his radio. Officer Reyes came across the room at a near run. She listened at the panel. She said something I couldn't hear. The young couple near us started crying. Lana stood up. What happened next happened in compressions. I'll do my best. Reyes ordered everyone in the conference center to move to the back wall. The 2 security officers braced the door with their bodies and a folding table. The pounding outside got worse, irregular, layered, the sound of more than 2 or 3 people. I heard a voice on the other side, a man's, screaming a name. Then I heard a sound that wasn't a voice anymore, behind the man's voice. Then the man's voice stopped. Reyes took the woman in the blazer aside. They spoke for 10 seconds. Then Reyes turned to the room and said, in a voice that carried without rising, that we were going to evacuate to the lifeboats. She said it would be in 3 groups, by section of the room. She said the security officers would lead. She said no one was to run. Lana looked at me. I looked at Beatrice. Beatrice was awake and watching us. She said, "Go." I started to speak. She held up her hand. "You'll be slow with me. Go now. I'll be in the 2nd group. Officer Reyes will help me." "I'm not afraid of this." Lana knelt down in front of her chair and took her hand. She said, "Thank you." Beatrice said, "Don't waste it." Lana stood up. We moved. The first group went out a side door I hadn't noticed before, a marked crew door that opened onto a service corridor running parallel to the main one. The pounding on the main door continued. The service corridor was narrow and lit by emergency strips along the floor. We moved fast, but not running. Lana was 3 people ahead of me. I counted heads. There were 14 of us in the first group, plus a security officer at the front and 1 at the back. The corridor ran for about 60 feet and ended at a marked muster door. The muster door opened onto an outdoor deck with 2 lifeboats hanging from their davits. The wind was harder than I'd expected. The sea was a flat gray with whitecaps. The sky was overcast. A crewman was already at the controls of the nearest boat. The hatch was open. Lana climbed in first and turned to help the people behind her. I helped a woman with a bad knee step over the threshold. I went in third. The boat was orange, enclosed, and smelled like rubber and old fuel. We loaded 14 people in about 90 seconds. The crewman counted us. He said the boat could take more and we should wait for the 2nd group. He left the hatch open and stepped out onto the deck. I stayed near the hatch because I wanted to see Beatrice come through. She didn't. The 2nd group came through the muster door 3 minutes later. Officer Reyes was leading them. There were 11 people. Beatrice was not among them. Reyes saw me at the hatch. She shook her head once. She said, "She told me to go ahead." She said it in the same way she'd said everything else, and then she helped the next person into the boat. I have spent a long time trying to decide what I felt at that moment. I think the honest answer is relief, followed immediately by shame at the relief. And then a third thing that wasn't either of those, and that I still don't have a word for. Lana put her hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything. The boat filled to capacity. The crewman closed the hatch. The launch was not gentle. The davit system released and the boat fell, and for 2 seconds everything in my body told me I was dying. And then we hit the water, and the boat rolled hard to port and then righted itself. People screamed. The crewman, whose name was Olu, yelled at us to stay in our seats and keep our straps tight. The boat's engines started. We pulled away from the side of the Meridian Estrella, which loomed above us like a wall. I looked back through the small porthole near my seat. I saw the second lifeboat launch. I saw a third one going. I saw, on a higher deck, figures at the railing, and I could not tell from that distance whether they were passengers or something else. I did not see any more lifeboats launch after the third one, and I do not know what happened to the people in the conference center who had been in the third group. The Coast Guard cutter found us 40 minutes later. They had been working their way through the lifeboats one by one, transferring people onto larger vessels staged offshore. The procedure was slow and very careful. They had us identify ourselves and submit to a temperature check before they brought us aboard. They separated us by row and told us not to speak to anyone outside our row. The officer who took my temperature was a young woman with red hair and very steady hands. She told me I was clear. She told me they would be moving us to a quarantine vessel for 72 hours of observation. She told me I'd done well. I don't know why she said that. I hadn't done anything. Lana was in the row in front of me. Her temperature was clear. The man next to her registered low-grade fever and was taken aside. He didn't argue. He sat down on a bench by himself and put his face in his hands. The quarantine vessel was a converted offshore supply ship the Coast Guard had requisitioned that morning. We spent 3 days on it in bunked cabins of 4. Lana was in a cabin 2 doors from mine. We ate together in the mess at scheduled times. We weren't allowed to touch. They took our temperatures twice a day. On the second day, a doctor came through and gave each of us a full screening, blood work, a long questionnaire, a neurological exam. I asked her what they were testing for. She said she couldn't tell me. She looked tired. She said the test was a process of elimination. On the third day, I cleared. Lana cleared. We were transferred to a Coast Guard cutter and brought into Key West, where we were processed through an emergency facility run jointly by FEMA and the Florida Department of Health. We were given dry clothes, hot meals, and access to phones. I called my sister. She was crying before I finished saying my name. The Meridian Estrella did not make Fort Lauderdale. It did not make the rendezvous point either. The official report, which I read months later, said the ship had been boarded by a Coast Guard team after the lifeboat evacuations were completed, and that the boarding team had encountered conditions that required the ship to be scuttled in deep water, about 60 miles east of its last known position. The report did not use the word infected. It used the phrase non-survivable contamination event. 273 passengers had been evacuated by lifeboat. The rest were not accounted for. Beatrice was not accounted for. Officer Reyes was, and I wrote her a letter, which she answered briefly and politely, and we didn't write again. Aldo was not accounted for. The captain, whose name was Captain Tomislav Bregovic, was on the bridge when the Coast Guard team boarded, and he survived the evacuation. And I sent him a letter through the cruise line that I do not know if he ever read. The virus was identified about 3 weeks later. It was a novel pathogen, transmitted through bodily fluids and producing the symptoms we had all witnessed, and a few we hadn't. 6 other ships in the Caribbean were affected over the following 2 months, with varying outcomes. The cruise industry never fully recovered. There were public hearings. There were lawsuits. There was, eventually, a vaccine for the worst variant of the virus, and a treatment protocol for the milder ones. The phrase, non-survivable contamination event, entered the language and is still used. I went home. I went back to commercial insurance. For the first 6 months, I did not sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. I spoke to a counselor, then to a therapist, then to a different therapist, and eventually I started sleeping normally again. I gained weight. I lost it. I started running. I bought a small house in a suburb I'd never planned to live in. I called my sister every Sunday. Lana and I exchanged phone numbers in the FEMA facility in Key West and texted each other twice in the first week, and then less, and then not at all. I assumed she was doing what I was doing, which was learning how to be a person again in a quiet way. About 4 months after we got back, I got a letter from her in the mail. It was handwritten, 3 pages, on the kind of yellow legal pad her father had probably used. She told me her father had died of a stroke 6 weeks after she'd come home, and that she had not handled it well. She told me she'd taken a leave from the transit authority. She told me she was thinking about moving. She asked if I would be open to talking on the phone. I called her that night. We talked for 2 hours. We talked about Beatrice. We talked about Officer Reyes. We talked about the desk in front of the door and the granola bars and the moment in the stairwell with Aldo and the axe. We talked about the lifeboat and the way the boat had rolled when it hit the water. We talked about the woman whose son had stayed in the cabin on deck 8 and whether there had ever been a way that story could have ended differently. Lana said no. I said I wasn't sure. We left it there. She moved that summer to a town outside Cleveland to be closer to a cousin. We saw each other in person twice that fall. The first time was awkward, in the way 2 people are awkward when they have shared something that no one else they know has shared and don't know how to act around it. The second time was easier. We didn't become a couple. I don't think either of us had room. We became something I don't have a clean word for. The kind of friend you call when something in the world reminds you of a thing only one other person could understand. She still does transit work. She still reads urban planning books at bars. She still has the half frown. She is the most competent person I have ever met, and I tell her so, and she tells me to stop. And the call ends, and I sit with my coffee for a while and look out the window at the small, ordinary street I live on now. A few things I want to put down before I close this notebook. I think about the door we opened for Beatrice. I think about the door we did not open for anyone else. I think about the fact that those were the same door. I think about the 2 security officers in the conference center who held it shut against the pounding. And I think about the fact that I do not know either of their names. I think about Aldo, who walked us down to deck 4 because he was going past it anyway. And I do not know whether that was true or whether it was a kindness he chose to phrase as a coincidence so that we would accept it. I think about the captain, who used the word managed 3 times in one announcement. And I think about how the ship moved like an evacuation while pretending to move like a vacation. And I think about the fact that pretending was probably the only thing keeping the corridors from becoming worse than they already were. I do not think he was lying. I think he was buying time in the only currency available to him, which was language. I think about Lana telling me, on the 3rd evening at the bar with the piano player, that pacing was the trick. I have come to believe that she meant something larger than club soda. She had paced her grief about her mother in a way that had not destroyed her, and she paced the ship the same way. And she paced the 4 months of silence between us before she wrote me the letter. And she paces the friendship we have now. I don't know if she thinks of it that way. I have not asked her. There are things you don't ask about a person you trust, because trusting them is the asking. I think about Beatrice's face when she said, "Don't waste it." I have not wasted it. I don't know if that is a thing you can know about yourself. I know that I have tried not to. I know that I have, on occasion, opened a door I did not have to open, and on other occasions kept a door closed that I could have opened. And I know that the difference between those moments was not always clear in the moment and is not always clear now. I know that the cost of getting it wrong was paid by other people. And I know that the cost of getting it right was paid by other people too. And that this is not a thing that resolves. The notebook ends here. I bought a new one last year, and I write in it sometimes, but it is not the same kind of notebook. The first one was for surviving. The second one is for living. They look the same from the outside. They are not the same from inside. I ran into Olu, the lifeboat crewman, at a memorial event in Miami about 18 months after the outbreak. He was working as a deckhand on a research vessel out of the University of Miami. He recognized me before I recognized him. He was thinner. He told me he had thought about quitting the sea after the Estrella and had decided that the sea was the only place he knew how to be. He told me he had launched our boat, and the boat after ours, and the boat after that, and that the third boat had not cleared the davits cleanly because the powered release had failed, and they'd had to use the hand crank, and that the crank had taken almost 4 minutes to free, and that during those 4 minutes, a group of infected had reached the muster deck. He told me he had closed the door on 3 people who were running toward the boat, because if he had not closed it, the boat would not have launched at all. He told me one of them was a woman in a blue blazer. He did not know if it was Officer Reyes. He had not stopped to look. He told me he had thought about her face every day since. I told him I was sorry. He said, "We did what we could." He said it in the same tone Lana would have used. I think he meant it the same way. I have come to believe that there is a particular voice that people use after something like that. A voice that is not flat exactly, but has had the dramatic register taken out of it, because the dramatic register is no longer available to describe what happened. I use that voice now in some parts of my life. I do not use it in others. I am still learning when each one is appropriate. The cruise line settled with the survivors and the families of the lost about 2 years after the event. The settlement was substantial and came with a non-disclosure clause that I did not sign. Most people signed it. I do not blame them. I simply could not see myself agreeing not to talk about Beatrice. I used the money I would have received to take a trip with my sister to a small town in Maine where neither of us knew anyone, and we walked on a beach in late October and did not talk about the ship at all. And then we drove home, and that is the whole story of that money. Lana and I took a train trip together last spring, her idea. From Cleveland to Chicago and back, 2 days, with a long lunch in the middle. She wanted to ride a route she had analyzed for work but never traveled. I sat across from her at a small table with a window between us and the gray Indiana farmland going by, and she told me about a project she was working on involving emergency egress from underground transit stations. And she asked me, for the first time since the ship, what I thought we should have done with Beatrice. I told her I thought we had done the only thing we could have done, which was let Beatrice make the decision herself. She said she had come to the same conclusion and had wanted to hear me say it before she let it settle. We got back to Cleveland that evening. I drove home the next morning. The road was empty. The radio was playing something I didn't know. I thought about the muster station drill on the first day, with Petar telling us not to run on the stairs. I thought about how I had not run on the stairs, not once, in all of it. I thought about how that had been Lana's discipline more than mine, and how I had borrowed it from her in the moment and then kept it after. And how the trip my sister had bought me had given me a person to borrow it from for the rest of my life. That is the story. I am writing this down because a reporter contacted me last month asking me to participate in a documentary, and I declined. And I felt afterward that I owed the event some private accounting of my own. This is that accounting. It is not complete. It does not balance. I do not expect it to. The notebook is on the desk next to me. The new one is on the shelf above. The ocean is 600 miles away in either direction, and I have not been on a boat since, and I do not know if I ever will be again. Lana has. She took a ferry across Lake Erie last year and texted me a photograph of the wake, and I looked at it for a long time and texted her back a single word, which was thanks, and which she understood.